Yes, so hello everyone. You can probably tell from the title already that I'm coming at drawing askance, I suppose, but I am going to get to drawing, I promise. I do feel like I need to give a little bit of context first. I'm talking about my current research, and at the moment I'm on AHRC Fellowship, and I'm combining academic research for that project with creative and visual methods that do involve drawing. What I'm trying to do broadly is address a gap in animal history, but also in the history of psychology, in the hope really of contributing to anthropocentrism, I suppose we call it, in psychology that's still persistent historically and today. So a key objective of the project, as well as doing academic research, is to produce artifacts, and they centre animal experience in Pavlov's laboratories. That's what I'm going to talk a bit more about. Those artifacts are a graphic novel, which I'll come back to, or a comic book, if you like, my preferred term, and also a diorama-based exhibition, diorama being a miniature scale model of a scene. So multiple dioramas, but I'm not going to talk much about that today. So yeah, what will I do? I'll talk a bit about the context, theoretical context for the project. Not in great detail, but the animal turn and animal studies, the context which I'm coming from, so I'll say a bit about that. Then I'm going to introduce Pavlov and his dogs. Then I'm going to get to do a little comics activity, which is fairly straightforward. I think nothing too much to worry about, but it'll give you a sense of what we're going through in terms of trying to pull this project together. Then I'll say a bit about work in progress, and talk about some of the positives and challenges so far. I say so far because we are, the project started in October 22 and it runs till May 24, so I'm 6 months in. I was just saying to Philip on the way here, this is the first time I've spoken to anyone face to face about the project, and so it's really nice to be able to do so, thank you, but also quite nerve-wracking. I feel like this is real, I've actually telling other people about it. So that's what I'm going to do, that's what I plan to do. So yeah, as I say, I'm going to start by talking about the animal turn and animal studies. So forgive me if you know about this already, I'm assuming you don't. It's generally the animal turn. We have lots of terms in academic work, don't we? But this particular one is about an increasing scholarly interest in animals the past few years, growing body of research, human animal, or multi-species, so two or more species in relationship together, including humans. Those kind of encounters, relationships, entanglements across different settings, and generally the role and status of animals in human society. So great deal of interest in animals in their own right as agents and actors, not just in terms of how we represent them across lots of different traditions. As it says in that second bullet point, animals as such, as participants in social relations that include humans, does require some kind of radical rethinking. A lot of this work originally came out of anthropology, so you can imagine anthropological, ethnographic methods. To some extent, I've always included representations in relations to animals, but to really include animals as such, as participants in social relations. Lots of rethinking around not just theory, but methodology and ethics too. So what comes with that is a related challenge to human exceptionalism in different disciplines as well, a tendency to focus on the human exclusively, or to downgrade anything that's not human, morally, ethically, politically, in terms of their rights and perspectives, and in academic disciplines, but also in wider society. And as is often the case, I think academia is catching up with what's going on already in culture, and we definitely see it being addressed in art, culture, politics, and academic research in the last 20, 30 years. Much more animal history, animal studies, focus on animals. I don't know if anyone's seen, just sprung to mind then, the documentary Cow, which is still in the iPlayer actually, which is an amazing, really close-up look at what it's like to be a cow on a dairy farm. Not sensationalist, really balanced, but I can't remember the director's name, which does an amazing job of getting down with the cow's perspective, so to speak, when she uses the camera and everything. But that's just one example. Lots of attempts, I'm sure, if you think of your own, of how animals are becoming more centred. So, though a latecomer, there is now a burgeoning interest in human-animal relations and animals in my discipline, psychology. So I'm kind of assuming lots of psychologists and people interested in psychology haven't really engaged with the detail of the animal turn yet. I think that's a reasonable assumption to make. Most of the work I'm talking about so far isn't in psychology, but it is starting to happen. So qualitative methods here for me include creative and visual methods, arts-based approaches as well. So that's enough context here. That's the context. We'll talk more about animal studies if you like later, but I'm focusing on Ivan Pavlov. So my way in to what I just talked about is via a very specific historical human-animal case study. Russian physiologist, come psychologist, Ivan Pavlov, 1849 to 1936, and particularly his laboratory work with dogs. Why Pavlov? Well, because he worked with dogs, so there's a human-animal relationship right there. But also, if you're not a psychology graduate or you don't work in psychology, you still heard of Pavlov, right? Yeah. What springs to mind, actually? Should ask when you think of Pavlov.
About making a noise and getting the dog to first, like, for a treat and that, making that association so that when they then hear that noise, even though there isn't a treat, they still sound it.
Yeah, that association, that's classical conditioning. So even if you don't do psychology, we know about this kind of, and we know that the dog was involved in that, right, as well. Yeah, that's part of it. So that's partly why, because it's got this, because Pavlov has this wider cultural resonance. That's why it shows Pavlov to some extent. And if you are a psychology student, which maybe I'm digging into this in a minute, but if you are a psychology student, you've definitely had a story told to you about Pavlov in a particular way. I'll talk a little bit about that story in a moment. So yeah, it's not that it's gone away. It's still there in psychologies of learning, histories of experimental psychology, histories of behaviourism, a kind of controversial school in psychology that Pavlov was a founding father of. He's still the 9th most cited psychologist in psychology textbooks. That's what I'm also interested in, is the kind of more public or more popular interfaces between psychology and the wider public. 6th most cited still in the US, which is where psychology still emanates from in terms of the most power, and 24th in a composite ranking of the most eminent in the 20th century. So I'm labouring a point now, you can see why I'm choosing Pavlov in an initial straightforward sense. So I said I was going to tell you about the story that gets told, particularly to psychologists, undergraduate psychologists, and also A-level. Interesting enough, my daughter's studying psychology at the moment, and she's just looked at Pavlov, and she's come back to me saying, "Is this true? Is this true? Is this how it should be?" But once I'm like, "Yes, I can tell you something." But practical stuff. And this is the story still being told. So we just mentioned classical conditioning, basically, and that's still celebrated as Jarries and Wilman say here, the foundation of the modern science of learning in the entire school of behaviour. It's hard to underestimate how significant those experiments are seen in the history of psychology. All the images here are from the Wellcome collection, freely available online. A really great source of medical, psychological, scientific photography. A great place, I went there a couple of weeks ago for the first time. So this particular photo is, I have to read the text that goes with the photo. Ivan Pavlov showing an experiment on a dog in the amphitheatre of the physiological laboratory. This is a military medical academy. I've already done most of the experiment, I've already taught. So you have to wear a military uniform to teach that. So Pavlov, the Russian physiologist for the first half of his career, which is not talked about that much these days, but first 30 years of his career, working with hundreds and hundreds of dogs. He was a physiologist, nothing to do with classical conditioning, much more interested in gastric juice, which I'm not going to go into in any detail. Most of us have heard of him because of what he started to do from 1900s onwards. He was born in 1849, remember, so he was in his 50s by then, already won the Nobel Prize for his physiological work. He started experimenting with dogs, pairing, feeding with different stimuli, as we said, discovering that dogs could learn through association. For example, metronome. Interestingly, he never used a bell. That's a common misconception. He used all sorts of stimuli: sound, taste, sight, some pretty grim, which is not talked about much. But anyway, I'm not trying to go into the history too much today. So I'll move myself on. This is the kind of focus that we still see in contemporary accounts of Pavlov today, contemporary retellings. Pavlov's achievements carry all before them. And the dogs appear, the dogs, this is what's important to me, apart from human-dog relations, they appear, how do they appear? As matters of fact, two-dimensional objects, if they're referred to at all. Dispensable objects, and kind of progressive teleology of psychology's progress, particularly as a science. Hard set laws, hard set laws. You can't get around the hard set laws, and they're derived from Ivan Pavlov's studies of animals and animals' activity. I could unpack that statement so much now I know a lot more about Pavlov. But allows animal behaviour to be broken down into predictable and modified processes. The language of the same thing. Always for Pavlov and always for everyone who references it. This is not comparative psychology, so it's not what a dog's like. Dogs are proxies for humans. They're standing in for universal processes. And this is the kind of language that's used, as in said it here, so dogs don't even need to be mentioned. Just about terminology. A conditioned stimulus provides the ability to trigger a response by the virtue of being paired with an unconditioned stimulus. So I did a fair bit of research into citations of Pavlov, and it's not anecdotal. Dogs are easily absent. So there's 700 plus page handbook of offerings in classical conditioning, 700 plus pages. McSweeney and Murphy, 2014. Dogs are only mentioned once by name as a creature in the whole thing. The role of dogs as living animals rarely feature in accounts of Pavlov's contributions to psychology. As living animals at all. When Pavlov's process is mentioned in any detail, how did he carry out the experiments, what was involved? Again, there really is a usual story of Pavlov's passion for dogs, his care for them, and his impeccable surgical technique. He was ambidextrous. So we still hear lots today in contemporary retellings about his care and his ability to look after the dogs in his care. And we see that in biographies, textbooks, and also accounts from the time as well. And we also do find, I'm not going to talk about Pavlov's own works much today, that he also consistently represented his dogs as happy and healthy in his own way. So what we have, we're left with a picture of order, predictability, rigour, and care, in which dogs are backgrounded with barely mentioned experimental objects, and definitely nothing to worry about. This is the kind of thing that you'll be familiar with Velocity's psychology textbook, or popular psychology, this kind of diagram. 2D, dogs are uniform, interchangeable, differentiated. They only exist really in the service of recounting Pavlov's experimental method, theory, discoveries. All actually central as well, still to this day, to psychology story itself, especially mainstream psychology story itself, as a science. Psychology has a long history of trying to present itself as a science to gain status and credibility. Yeah, reality psychology is more complex than that because it's about humans. But anyway, so bringing these things so far together, trying to kind of in sum so far, there are a lack of widely shared narratives about experimental animals. There are other experimental animals that we've chosen. Skinner's pigeons. We've probably heard about Skinner and behaviours and too. That's another story. Or Harry Harlan and his monkeys, rhesus monkeys. There is more controversy in how we treated those. But anyway, there are a lack of widely shared narratives about experimental animals for sure, beyond the basic and/or anthropocentric. This is what I'm claiming, especially in psychology. So what I want to do is address this gap and bring animal studies insights to psychologists, but also to wider and non-academic audiences. That's because I'm personally just really taken by animal studies arguments and theories perspectives. And I want to use Pavlov's books as a case study. And I want to do it through methods and media capable of reaching wider audiences. And I'm biased here because I also have a passion for comics, graphic novels. And I felt like, I dreamed that this would be a good way of trying to tell Pavlov's story. And eventually, someone else agreed that I could do it. So that's what we're in the process of doing at the moment, as well as creating these dioramas. So before I get to drawing, nearly there, I'm just going to talk a little bit about comics and comics-based research as another context for what I'm doing. Comics, a bit like Philip said about defining drawing, avoid getting involved in debates about what a comic is or isn't. Comic books, graphic novels, sequential art. Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics. I've got round to reading that, so I thought I should. And then it blew my mind, not just as a book about comics, but a book about art and drawing and representation, and what the possibilities are. I strongly recommend that to anyone interested in drawing practice. We might define comics as Scott McCloud does there, juxtaposing pictorial with the images in the sequence. There's a sequence to comics. It's a visual medium used to express ideas and stories with images, normally organised in a sequence. Separate panels, of course, in comics too. I guess the key to comics is imagery that can combine with text, which can take various forms: captions, speech bubbles, thought balloons, sound effects. And there's also this strange area of emanata. I didn't realise what all that until I started researching comics. The things that emanate from a character or an object, symbolising something about that character. It could be sweat through a drop, it could be anxiety through the same drop. We all know emanata, just never refer to them as. Comics-based research, what's that? Again, I'm not going to get too bogged down in the detail of that, but people who write about it say that it's a kind of broad field. For those who are interested in the uniqueness of comics, drawing, images, but also text, and the endless combinations thereof. And that might be working with participants, so using it as a research method, a bit like what many of you are familiar with in terms of drawing. But also as a way of sharing research findings with audiences, and also in the creation of comics as part of the research process in other ways. So my approach, this is why I feel a bit like an imposter today, even more than usual, involves translating the fruits of traditional desk-based research, I suppose. I spent a long time researching archives, biographies, and so on. So traditional desk-based research, like Bible research. I'm trying to translate that into the medium of comics. Why am I an imposter? Because I'm not doing the drawing. I'll come back to that in a moment. In terms of a specific genre, I've discovered that the closest to what we're doing is probably a hybrid of creative non-fiction, which is non-fiction, but telling it more using the kind of devices of fiction writers. You might know about that already. And graphic non-fiction, so a graphic novel. There are lots of subgenres of graphic novels now. Graphic medicine and graphic non-fiction, or generally as an attempt to do biography or non-fiction stories using comics. Anyway, more on that shortly. I think now what we need to do is I'll let go of something which will preempt what I want to talk about in the second half. Say second half, So, we've got some paper, and yeah, I can help you say, it's going to take me a second. I'm totally aware of this kind of anxiety you might have, because I have it myself about drawing, so I'm making this really straightforward. It's definitely not about artistic ability, but it's I hope it'll give you a chance to think about some of the things we're having to think about in writing this story. So what we're going to get you to do is just divide one page into four, so we've got 4 panels. You can work on your own, you can do it with someone next to you. I really don't mind how you do it, I'm not going to do it for long. I've written a script, say script, here it is. A person is with a dog, the person does something that involves or affects the dog in some way, the dog reacts, and then the human reacts. Reading to that's reading if you like. Just in case you can't draw, like me. I'm laughing about have you tried drawing a dog? I mean, not that I draw anyway, but I find it really difficult somehow. Anyway, there's some guides to drawing a dog. So I don't know, I'll give you 10 minutes to do that. You have the world of comics at your disposal. You can do it any way you like. It really doesn't matter. But we'll kind of hand some paper and pens out and give it a go. Well, this one, apart from having a bit of fun with some drawing. So I did say I haven't been drawing, and that's something I feel a bit of an imposter about. But yeah, that exercise speaks to something really important to what we're trying to do, which is human-canine interaction, which of course is key. If I want to do something animal studies oriented around Pavlov's life, then I want to shift the narrative away from Pavlov's life towards the lives of the dogs. And yeah, this is where we are. So for this particular fellowship, I didn't have faith in my own drawing ability, sad to say. So I asked for enough money in the project to hire an illustrator. And the plan was I didn't know the illustrator would be at that point, but the plan was for the illustrator to be a co-author as well, because I see drawings in comic books as a authorship. And then we collaborated on the story. I wrote a script, a rough script, but then we collaborated on the story. And together, but with Sophie Burrows, who ended up being the illustrator, doing the drawing. And we did agree that she would be here for this kind of event, but she selfishly went off and had a baby. So that side of the project is paused for a few months, and she'll be back and we'll continue. Work in progress then. So early days, still translating the script into something visual that works as comics. No colour, no proper speech bubbles. No art to detail yet, but this is what it starts to look like. This is what Sophie calls the roughs, and I'll zoom in a little bit. This is the prologue. So I know you can't read the writing, but I'll just talk you through basically. So I decided to start the story, and I'll talk through some of the decisions briefly as I do. With Pavlov, he's alive, he's old, he's about to unveil a statue of a dog, a real thing, in the grounds of his St. Petersburg, what was at this moment Leningrad. In the grounds of his physiology department, a dog statue that's in honour of all the dogs sacrificed, their sacrifice for science, lots of inscriptions on them. So in this first panel, it's about to be unveiled, and Pavlov does the unveiling by the final panel there, and having a chat and doing some setting up of the context here. Then it's revealed, the dog. I will say the inscription there, which is a real inscription. Let the dog assistant and friend of man from prehistoric times be sacrificed to science, for our dignity obliges us that this should happen without fail and always without unnecessary torment. Anyway, everyone goes off to reception, and this is a key narrative device which we've gone for in the end, is that the dog statue starts talking to Ivan. And it starts off by questioning whether the dogs really are happy and healthy. Pavlov's on the defensive. Once he's taken in the fact that it's being talked to by a dog statue. Yes, many visitors comment that you're treated as well as human patients. And then here, Rosa, as she's called, I give all the dogs names in the story. Then she starts to talk about some of the things that I've discovered did happen to the dogs. Often bad, not always. And also lots of doubts about the theoretical model that we all accept now. So we start to introduce that. And the premise of the story is that Rosa says, right, okay, come on. About time we said what really happened, don't you? So that's the premise then, we're going back through Pavlov's life. But we're being introduced to a counter story here because Rosa is sharing the narrative duties with Pavlov. Does that make sense? So they do a bit of introductory work here, and from there we go into the detail of the story. Kind of we zoom back to Pavlov's early days, etc. Oh yeah. So yeah, I'm talking about what really happened Ivan to us. Okay. So where do we start? Let's go back to the beginning. That's just a placeholder on that map. Your beginning, that is. No secrets, no lies. And then I use that as a springboard to kind of go back to Pavlov's early days and then the rest of his life as he the dogs become more and more important to him. So, yeah, just a couple more slides on the kind of positives so far and the challenges. Yeah, I mean, I do love comics, so I'm biased already, but I'm already totally enamored with the possibilities of combining text and image. You know, I can have a dog that talks. A difficult decision. None of the other dogs talk in the book. There are pros and cons for that. I didn't want to anthropomorphise them too much because I felt like I wanted to honour the dogs' moments on the experimenter stand and where they were housed, their lives, and it felt like experimenting that having them talking took away from that. But I fudged it. I hedged my bets by also having a dog narrator. But she's a statue, so it doesn't say. Anyway, probably going too much into detail. But you know, what's it allowed us to do? I can individualise animals, so if you can, like give them more distinctive looks in the book, as well as give them names. We can use, as some of you might have done in your drawings, a dog's eye perspective, so we can see a panel or a scene as if being seen by a dog, and that's turning out to be a really important thing to do, to be able to do, when we want to engage with what it's like to have been a dog during these times. But comics also allows us to locate canine lives within these kind of bigger shifting timeframes. So a lot happened, as you can imagine, between the stories roughly between 1860 and 1925. So a lot happened in Russia, a lot happened in St. Petersburg, and the dogs were often entangled with it during that period. So we can tell, hopefully, an interesting story as well that's still doing something different from the breakdown of science narrative. What else? Yep, so it's been a fascinating process for me already. The research I've already done was helpful, but in working with an illustrator and just writing a script, you need to come to know the story in a different way. So some of the details, like, I don't know now, off the top of my head, like the dress, or what people ate, or how they drink their tea, or the kind of the way that what political slogans look like. That kind of detail I didn't have, and now I need to understand, and it really helps to frame the story in a different way. The drawing style is so important, I've realised, and so of course every drawer draws in a unique way, and that's still the same professional illustrator. I love Sophie's style. There are reasons for me choosing this kind of more comic, looser style. I think it puts the dogs and the animals on more equal, the dogs and humans on what we call footing, and it's less realistic because they depict it more closely in a similar way. But there are other ways of doing it. So someone like commissioned to some drawings earlier on. Still a fantastic drawing, but completely different. This is one of these drawings, much more realistic, and if I'd gone down this route, it would be a different story, not just different drawings. So challenges, conveying animal experience and agency is it feels like a really difficult thing to do already, and it feels. I suppose the word here is, what is the word? Fidelity, yeah. It's one thing when you're doing biographical work, I'm finding, to kind of try and be honest and close to the original source, but also tell a dramatic story. It's another thing to try and do that with animals who don't talk, can't talk, and who are generally ignored in the literature. So we have to take all sorts of liberties, and we have to imagine their experience. So I've done a lot of reading around dogs, how dogs experience the world, but how do you really know? Even with animal biologists, then we're still making a leap. But I think making the attempt to do so is important. But it's tricky. Another challenge is with the narrative focus. So in the original, I really wanted to focus almost exclusively on the dogs. The dogs didn't live very long, so for character development over the period of the book, that's actually a really difficult thing to do. So I just refocus the story and tell it in terms of Pavlov's life as the anchor more than I intended to get that balance right, I think. Also a balance in terms of how much I depict the violence and suffering involved. There was a great deal that the dogs went through. I don't only want the story to be about, oh my God, wasn't that awful? I want to tell a bigger story about the time and the lives and science. So there's a balance there of how much of that we show. And oh my God, it's so time consuming, the whole thing. I mean, I would probably estimate, because I started working on it before the project officially began, it took me about 4 months full time to write a script for the first time. And that was dedicated to that. And then as soon as my scripts that I was skipping along thinking, oh, I'm a script writer, this isn't so bad. As soon as I put it with the drawings, it was like, oh my God, so much of this is so clunky, it doesn't work. you know, so I now see that combination of drawing and text as a kind of staging post, an initial staging post, nowhere near the kind of, oh, we're done, which I didn't know in theory, but then in practice it's definitely true. There's a lot more collaboration involved from there. And collaborating across different, you know, different modes, speech, text, image, is complicated, it's a difficult process for me anyway. I've had lots of moments where I'm really struggling and feeling totally out of my depth while still loving the whole process. So yeah, I mean, I did want to kind of make a plug for myself as a drawer in this kind of scenario, not as in terms of quality, but it's really reignited my own drawing practice, which I've done as a hobby in the past great deal. But I've had to draw a lot for Sophie, so in terms of a script, I've also needed to sketch out scenes and panels for her. But what I also started doing at the beginning of this project is a visual research diary, and that's helped enormously. I mean, it's a completely different, I've discovered this, I mean, obviously this is all what you know already, but it's such a different way of thinking, not just a different way of trying to get on a page what you're thinking. It encourages and facilitates a different way of thinking about what you're doing when you're trying to draw, represent what you're doing by drawing. So you know, I found that so helpful, as well as discovering, I don't know if anyone else has discovered, this is a way of drawing yet, but I am a convert to a pencil or whatever, and drawing on a screen. I thought maybe I wouldn't like that, or it wouldn't feel authentic. In some ways it doesn't, but also it's a really nice way of drawing in terms of producing sketches and using these more for diagonal-based exhibition so far. But it really has reignited my drawing practice too. So I felt like I had to make that claim, make that clear before I finished. So yeah, thank you.